Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn, and today we're diving into one of the most bizarre criminal cases in American history. On August 28, 2003, in Erie, Pennsylvania, a pizza delivery man named Brian Wells walked into a bank with a metal collar bomb locked around his neck. What followed was a nightmarish scenario involving a bank robbery, a deadly scavenger hunt, and a cast of characters that could only exist in reality, because fiction would find them too implausible. Was Wells an innocent victim or a willing participant? Who masterminded this elaborate death trap? And how did a frozen corpse in a garage freezer eventually crack the case wide open? Join me as we unravel the twisted tale of the pizza bomber case, a story that proves once again that truth is far stranger than fiction. August 28, 2003 began like any other summer day in Erie, Pennsylvania. The sun shone brightly over the blue waters of Lake Erie, and residents went about their daily routines in this quiet lakeside community. But by mid-afternoon, this ordinary day would transform into one of the most bizarre criminal cases in American history. At approximately 2:28 p.m., a pizza delivery man named Brian Wells walked into the PNC Bank on Peach Street. Unlike the typical bank robber who might wear a mask or brandish a weapon, Wells had something far more terrifying strapped to his neck, a metal collar with a locked box attached to it. He handed the teller a note demanding $250,000. The note explained that the device around his neck was a bomb, and if the teller didn't comply quickly, it would detonate. The teller, understandably frightened, handed over $8,702, far less than the demanded amount, but all that was accessible from her drawer. Wells, appearing nervous and agitated, took the money and left the bank. He walked out to his car, a green Geo Metro that was parked nearby. But Wells wouldn't get far. Just 15 minutes after the robbery, police spotted his vehicle in a nearby parking lot and conducted a traffic stop. They ordered him out of his car and made him lie face down on the ground. As officers approached, Wells made a shocking statement. "I'm not doing this because I want to. I have a bomb around my neck." The officers, maintaining their distance, could see that Wells indeed had a strange metal device secured around his neck. Wells told them he was a hostage, not a willing participant. According to him, someone had forced him to rob the bank by locking this bomb to his body. Even more alarming, Wells claimed that he had been given a list of instructions he had to follow precisely, or the bomb would detonate. Wells told police that he had been delivering a pizza to a remote location, an address at the end of a dirt road. When he arrived, he was ambushed by several men who placed the collar bomb around his neck at gunpoint. They gave him a note with detailed instructions on how to rob the bank and then disarm the bomb by completing a series of tasks afterward, essentially a deadly scavenger hunt against the clock. As Wells sat handcuffed on the pavement, he became increasingly distressed. "I don't have a lot of time," he pleaded with the officers. "I'm not lying. I don't want to die." The police, following protocol for a potential explosive device, evacuated the area and called for the bomb squad. But the bomb squad was still en route when, at 3:18 p.m., just about an hour after the bank robbery, the device around Brian Wells's neck began to beep. The beeping was followed by an explosion. Despite being just feet away, the officers could do nothing as the bomb detonated, killing Brian Wells instantly. The horrific scene was captured by local news cameras that had arrived to cover what they thought was a routine bank robbery arrest. In the aftermath of the explosion, investigators discovered that Wells had been carrying a cane that was actually a homemade shotgun disguised to look like a walking stick. In his car, they found a series of handwritten notes with detailed instructions, much like a treasure hunt. Each note led to the next location where another note would be found, with the promise that completing all the tasks would lead to keys and instructions to remove the bomb before it detonated. The first note instructed Wells to rob the bank. Subsequent notes directed him to various locations around Erie, with complex directions and time limits. The tasks were impossible to complete within the time frame given. The bomb was designed to explode before Wells could ever finish the game. The case immediately captured national attention. Was Brian Wells a victim or a willing participant? Who had designed this elaborate, deadly plot? And why? The FBI took charge of the investigation, which they codenamed Collar Bomb. Agents meticulously examined every piece of evidence. The bomb itself was remarkably sophisticated, consisting of a hinged metal collar locked around Wells's neck, with a box containing pipes, wires, and a timer. The device had been custom-built by someone with significant knowledge of explosives. The handwritten notes found in Wells' car and at various drop sites around Erie provided crucial clues. The notes were distinctive, written in a peculiar style with specific phrases and misspellings. Investigators believed they could identify the author if they found matching handwriting samples. As they dug deeper into Brian Wells's life, a complex picture emerged. Wells was 46 years old and had worked as a pizza delivery driver at Mamma Mia's Pizzeria for several years. He lived alone in a small apartment and was described by those who knew him as quiet and somewhat reclusive. He had no criminal record and no known connections to anyone who might orchestrate such an elaborate crime. The investigation took an unexpected turn when just 3 weeks after Wells's death, the body of a man named Robert Panetti was found in his home. Panetti, 43, was a co-worker of Wells at the pizzeria. His death was ruled an accidental drug overdose, but the timing raised eyebrows. Was it truly a coincidence that Wells's co-worker died so soon after the collar bomb incident? Investigators weren't convinced. Then, in November 2003, a local Erie resident named William Rothstein called police to report a body in his freezer. When officers arrived at his home, they indeed found a frozen corpse, that of James Roden, the boyfriend of Rothstein's former fiancée, Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. Rothstein claimed that Diehl-Armstrong had killed Roden and asked him to help dispose of the body. This seemed unrelated to the collar bomb case, but as investigators dug deeper, connections began to emerge. William Rothstein was a mechanical engineer and substitute science teacher with an exceptional intellect. His home was filled with tools, electronics, and various mechanical components. He had the knowledge and skills to construct a sophisticated explosive device like the one used in the collar bomb. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong had a troubled history. She was highly intelligent, a former high school valedictorian and college student, but struggled with bipolar disorder and other mental health issues. She also had a dark past. In 1984, she had been acquitted of murdering her boyfriend, Robert Thomas, on grounds of self-defense. In 1988, she pled guilty but mentally ill to another boyfriend's murder and served 7 years in prison. As investigators delved into the backgrounds of Rothstein and Diehl-Armstrong, they began to see possible connections to the collar bomb case. Both had the intelligence to plan such an elaborate scheme. Rothstein had the technical knowledge to build the bomb, and both had connections to the area where Brian Wells had reportedly been delivering pizza on the day of the robbery. The investigation was painstaking. The FBI conducted hundreds of interviews, analyzed the bomb components, studied the handwritten notes, and examined cell phone records. They also looked into the financial situations of all potential suspects, searching for motives. Gradually, a theory emerged. Investigators began to suspect that Brian Wells might not have been merely an innocent victim as initially thought. There were indications that he might have had some knowledge of the plot beforehand, possibly believing the bomb would be fake, or that he would have ample time to complete the tasks and remove it. In July 2007, nearly 4 years after the crime, federal prosecutors announced that they believed Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was the mastermind behind the plot. According to their theory, she had orchestrated the bank robbery to obtain money to hire a hitman to kill her father, Harold Diehl, to secure an inheritance. William Rothstein had allegedly built the bomb, and another man, Kenneth Barnes, was also involved in the conspiracy. By this time, William Rothstein had died of cancer in July 2004, never having been charged in the case. Diehl-Armstrong was already serving time for the murder of James Roden, whom prosecutors believed she had killed because he knew too much about the collar bomb plot. In July 2008, Diehl-Armstrong and Kenneth Barnes were indicted for the collar bomb plot. Barnes eventually pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Diehl-Armstrong in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial of Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong began in October 2010. Prosecutors painted her as the mastermind who had recruited Rothstein, Barnes, and possibly others to help with her scheme. They alleged that Wells had been at least somewhat aware of the plot initially, believing he would be participating in a fake bank robbery with a fake bomb. However, when he arrived at the meeting point, he discovered the bomb was real and was forced to go through with the robbery under threat of immediate detonation. Kenneth Barnes testified that Diehl-Armstrong had approached him about killing her father and had planned the bank robbery to get the money to pay him. He claimed that Wells had been chosen because he was known to be punctual on his delivery routes, making his movements predictable. The defense portrayed Diehl-Armstrong as a victim of her own mental illness, manipulated by Rothstein, whom they suggested was the true mastermind. They pointed out that much of the evidence against her came from convicted felons seeking reduced sentences. Throughout the trial, Diehl-Armstrong was a disruptive presence, frequently interrupting proceedings with outbursts. Despite her lawyers' efforts, the evidence against her was substantial. On November 1, 2010, after just 11 hours of deliberation, the jury found Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong guilty of armed bank robbery, conspiracy to commit armed bank robbery, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence. In February 2011, she was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. At her sentencing, U.S. District Judge Sean McLaughlin described the crime as a horrific premeditated murder and called Diehl-Armstrong a coldly calculated criminal. Kenneth Barnes received a 45-year sentence, later reduced to 22.5 years for his cooperation. Another alleged conspirator, Floyd Stockton, Rothstein's roommate at the time, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, though he ultimately never testified due to health issues. The case seemed resolved, but questions remained. Some investigators still wondered about Brian Wells's level of involvement. Was he truly an unwitting victim, or had he agreed to participate in what he thought would be a non-lethal crime? The full truth died with him on that asphalt parking lot. The collar bomb case, often referred to as Pizza Bomber in the media, remains one of the most bizarre and complex criminal conspiracies in American history. It combined elements of a bank heist, a scavenger hunt, a hostage situation, and a public execution into one horrifying event. For the residents of Erie, Pennsylvania, the case left an indelible mark. The image of Brian Wells sitting handcuffed on the ground, pleading for help as a bomb ticked away around his neck, was impossible to forget. The subsequent investigation revealed a tangled web of troubled individuals whose paths had crossed in the most tragic way possible. In the years following her conviction, Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong maintained her innocence. She filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. She gave interviews from prison, offering alternative theories and blaming others for the crime. In one interview, she claimed that Rothstein had been the mastermind and had framed her. Diehl-Armstrong died in federal prison in April 2017 at the age of 68 from breast cancer. She took whatever secrets she still held to her grave. The FBI officially closed the collar bomb investigation in 2018, 15 years after Brian Wells walked into that PNC bank. They concluded that the major perpetrators had been identified and that justice, as much as possible, had been served. But the case continues to fascinate and horrify the public. It has been the subject of books, documentaries, and television episodes. The Netflix documentary series Evil Genius, released in 2018, brought renewed attention to the case, exploring the twisted personalities involved and raising questions about whether all aspects of the crime had truly been solved. For the investigators who worked the case, it was unlike anything they had encountered before or since. FBI Special Agent Jerry Clark, who spent years on the investigation, later co-authored a book about the case titled Pizza Bomber: The Untold Story of America's Most Shocking Bank Robbery. The Pizza Bomber case stands as a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the persistence of law enforcement in the face of a seemingly unsolvable crime. It reminds us that sometimes truth is indeed stranger than fiction, and that behind the headlines of sensational crimes are real victims whose lives are forever altered. For Brian Wells, a man who by all accounts lived a quiet, ordinary life, August 28, 2003, began as just another workday. He could never have imagined that he would become the central figure in one of America's most bizarre criminal cases, or that his final moments of fear and desperation would be broadcast on television screens across the nation. The collar bomb that killed Brian Wells was a marvel of malevolent engineering. Investigators who examined it after the tragedy were struck by its sophisticated design. The device consisted of a hinged metal collar that locked around Wells's neck, with a box attached containing multiple pipe bombs, a timer, and a locking mechanism. The collar itself was secured with 4 keyless locks, which could only be opened with specific keys that Wells was supposedly going to find by completing his scavenger hunt tasks. The bomb's creator had included anti-tampering mechanisms that would trigger detonation if anyone tried to remove it improperly. This level of complexity suggested that the builder had significant knowledge of explosives and mechanical systems, knowledge that William Rothstein, with his background in engineering, certainly possessed. The handwritten notes found with Wells and at the scavenger hunt locations were equally intricate. They contained detailed instructions, hand-drawn maps, and warnings about time limits. The writing style was distinctive, with unusual phrases and deliberate misspellings that investigators believed were intended to disguise the author's identity. One note read, "Sit down and read this carefully. You have a bomb around your neck. This is no joke. You have 3 minutes to get away from the bank. Act normal. Do not get anybody's attention to you or the bomb will explode. The bomb around your neck cannot be removed without the keys. There are several keys needed to remove the bomb. The keys are in different locations." The instructions continued. "The first key is in a location that requires you to drive and search. The first location is a small park approximately 2 miles from the bank. Under a rock painted with a black X, you will find the next set of instructions. You have 25 minutes to reach this location or the bomb will detonate." The notes were clearly designed to create a situation where Wells could never succeed. The time constraints were impossible to meet, especially after being delayed by the bank robbery itself and then by police intervention. Investigators concluded that Wells was never meant to survive this ordeal. As the FBI delved deeper into the backgrounds of the conspirators, they uncovered a strange collection of individuals whose lives had intersected in Erie's underbelly. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong's history was particularly disturbing. Beyond her previous murder cases, those who knew her described a brilliant but deeply troubled woman whose life was marked by volatile relationships and erratic behavior. Her intelligence was undeniable. She had graduated as valedictorian of her high school class and attended college, where she studied education and music. but her promising future was derailed by severe mental illness, later diagnosed as bipolar disorder with histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders. Former friends and acquaintances described how Diehl-Armstrong could be charming and articulate one moment, then explode into rage the next. She collected stuffed animals but also hoarded guns. She taught music lessons to children but had a history of violence against the men in her life. William Rothstein, her former fiancé and alleged co-conspirator, was equally complex. A substitute science teacher with an IQ reportedly in the genius range, Rothstein lived in a house that doubled as a workshop filled with tools, electronic parts, and half-completed projects. Neighbors described him as eccentric but helpful, often offering to fix appliances or cars. Rothstein's home on Peach Street sat just a short distance from the transmission tower where Brian Wells had allegedly been forced to wear the collar bomb. This geographic connection was one of many pieces that led investigators to suspect his involvement. Kenneth Barnes, another key player in the conspiracy, had a long criminal record and a severe drug habit. He had known Diehl-Armstrong for years and, according to his testimony, had agreed to help with the plot in exchange for money to feed his cocaine addiction. Barnes later told investigators that Diehl-Armstrong needed $250,000 to pay him to kill her father, explaining the specific amount demanded in the bank robbery note. Floyd Stockton, Rothstein's roommate at the time, was also implicated. According to Barnes's testimony, Stockton had helped hold Wells down while the collar was placed around his neck. Stockton was granted immunity for his cooperation, though health problems ultimately prevented him from testifying. The relationship between these individuals was complex and often contentious. Diehl-Armstrong and Rothstein had once been engaged but had a falling out years before the collar bomb plot. Despite this, they maintained contact, with Rothstein occasionally helping Diehl-Armstrong with various tasks, including, most disturbingly, storing the body of her boyfriend James Roden in his freezer after she allegedly shot him for threatening to reveal the bank robbery plan. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, they determined that the collar bomb plot had been in development for months before August 28, 2003. The conspirators had allegedly conducted surveillance on the PNC Bank, crafted the bomb, written the instructions, and planned the scavenger hunt locations carefully. The selection of Brian Wells as the bomber was not random. As a pizza delivery driver, his movements were predictable, and he regularly delivered to areas near the homes of the conspirators. Kenneth Barnes later testified that Wells had been chosen specifically because he was known to be timely and reliable in his deliveries. One of the most contentious aspects of the case was the question of Wells' involvement. Initially portrayed as an innocent victim, evidence later suggested that Wells might have had some knowledge of the plot beforehand. Barnes testified that Wells had agreed to participate in what he thought would be a fake bank robbery using a fake bomb, only to discover too late that the conspirators had double-crossed him with a real explosive device. The FBI ultimately concluded that Wells was a participant, albeit a reluctant one. This determination was based on witness statements, the timing of events on the day of the robbery, and the fact that Wells had the disguised shotgun in his possession. However, the extent of his willing participation remains disputed. Some investigators continued to believe that Wells was completely innocent, coerced into the robbery with no prior knowledge. Wells's family vehemently rejected the suggestion that he was anything but a victim. They pointed out that he had no criminal record and no apparent motive to participate in such a scheme. His brother John Wells became an outspoken advocate, arguing that Brian had been unfairly portrayed and that the investigation had focused too quickly on the theory of his complicity rather than exploring all possibilities. The investigation was complicated by the death of William Rothstein in July 2004, less than a year after the crime. Rothstein succumbed to lymphoma before he could be charged or questioned extensively about the case. In a bizarre twist, he had left a suicide note in 2003 shortly after the collar bomb incident, but didn't go through with taking his life. The note made no mention of the Wells case, instead focusing on his breakup with a girlfriend. Before his death, Rothstein had been interviewed by the FBI regarding the murder of James Roden, whose body was found in his freezer. During these interviews, he denied any involvement in the collar bomb case. Without Rothstein's testimony, investigators had to rely heavily on statements from Diehl-Armstrong and Barnes, both of whom had incentives to minimize their own roles. The trial of Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong in 2010 brought many of these details to light. Prosecutors presented a theory that Diehl-Armstrong, desperate for money to pay Barnes to kill her father, had masterminded the plot. They alleged that Rothstein had built the bomb, while Diehl-Armstrong, Barnes, and Stockton had helped execute the plan. During the trial, Diehl-Armstrong took the stand in her own defense, a decision that proved disastrous for her case. Her testimony was rambling and contradictory, filled with accusations against others and denials of her involvement. She claimed that Rothstein had framed her and that Barnes was lying to secure a reduced sentence. The prosecution presented damning evidence, including testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed Diehl-Armstrong had confessed to her involvement while in prison for Roden's murder. They also introduced evidence showing that she had made multiple phone calls to Barnes on the day of the robbery. Perhaps most significantly, handwriting experts testified that the distinctive writing style on the notes found with Wells matched samples of Diehl-Armstrong's handwriting. The unusual phrases and deliberate misspellings were consistent with her known writing patterns. After her conviction, Diehl-Armstrong continued to proclaim her innocence from prison. In interviews, she offered alternative theories and pointed fingers at others. She claimed that Rothstein had been obsessed with her and had framed her out of spite. She also suggested that the FBI had bungled the investigation and ignored evidence that would have exonerated her. In one prison interview, she said, "I had nothing to do with any collar bomb. That was all Bill Rothstein and his friends. I'm being set up because I know too much about other things." Her appeals were all denied, and she remained in federal prison until her death in 2017. Even as cancer claimed her life, she maintained her innocence, leaving behind a legacy of mystery and unanswered questions. The collar bomb case had a profound impact on Erie, Pennsylvania. The lakeside city of about 100,000 residents had experienced its share of crime over the years, but nothing approaching the bizarre nature of this incident. Local residents spoke of a loss of innocence, a feeling that if something this strange and horrific could happen in their community, nowhere was truly safe. The case also changed bank security protocols across the country. The unusual nature of the robbery, a man with a bomb forced to commit the crime, led many banks to implement new training for employees on how to handle hostage situations and threats involving explosives. The FBI incorporated lessons from the case into their training programs for responding to complex criminal scenarios. For law enforcement officials who worked the case, it became a career-defining investigation. FBI Special Agent Jerry Clark, who spent years pursuing leads and building the case against the conspirators, later reflected on the toll it took. "This was not just another bank robbery," he said in an interview. "This was a case that haunted everyone involved. The image of Brian Wells in his final moments is something none of us will ever forget." Clark and journalist Ed Palatella later co-authored Pizza Bomber, The Untold Story of America's Most Shocking Bank Robbery, providing an inside look at the investigation. The book detailed the painstaking work that went into solving the case, from analyzing bomb fragments to tracking down witnesses to deciphering the complex relationships between the conspirators. The Netflix documentary series Evil Genius, released in 2018, brought renewed attention to the case. The 4-part series, directed by Barbara Schroeder and Trey Borzilieri, explored the personalities involved and raised questions about whether justice had truly been served. Borzilieri had corresponded with Diehl-Armstrong for years while researching the case, giving viewers a glimpse into her manipulative personality. The documentary also highlighted the tragic figure of Brian Wells. Whether he was a willing participant or an innocent victim, the final moments of his life were marked by fear and desperation. Footage of Wells sitting handcuffed on the ground, pleading with officers as the bomb ticked down, remains one of the most disturbing images in American criminal history. "They're going to shoot me," Wells told officers in his final minutes, apparently referring to the conspirators who had placed the bomb on him. "I don't have a lot of time." His last words underscored the human tragedy at the center of this bizarre case. Whatever his level of involvement, Brian Wells died a terrifying death on a public street, his final moments captured on camera for the world to see. In the aftermath of the case, Wells's family fought to clear his name. His brother John became particularly vocal, arguing that the FBI had wrongly labeled Brian as a co-conspirator without sufficient evidence. The Wells family pointed out that no direct evidence linked Brian to the planning of the crime, and that the testimony claiming his willing participation came from convicted felons with reasons to lie. "My brother was a victim, not a criminal," John Wells said in numerous interviews. "He was used and discarded by these people, and then his reputation was destroyed after his death." The family's perspective highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the case, the impossibility of ever knowing with absolute certainty what role Brian Wells played. Without his testimony, investigators had to rely on the accounts of others, all of whom had reasons to minimize their own culpability. The psychological dimensions of the case fascinated criminologists and mental health professionals. Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong, in particular, became a subject of study. Her combination of high intelligence and severe mental illness created a dangerous mix. Experts who reviewed the case suggested that her disorders may have contributed to both her capacity to plan such an elaborate crime and her inability to maintain the secret afterward. William Rothstein remained equally enigmatic. Those who knew him described a brilliant but socially awkward man who lived largely in his own world of mechanical projects and intellectual pursuits. His decision to call police about Roden's body in his freezer, effectively opening the door to the entire investigation, suggested a complex moral framework that even he may not have fully understood. The technical aspects of the case also drew attention from experts. The collar bomb itself was studied by explosives specialists who marveled at its sophisticated design. The FBI laboratory determined that the device had been constructed with considerable skill, using common materials in uncommon ways. The bomb contained multiple pipe bombs filled with double-base smokeless powder, a timing device, and anti-tampering mechanisms. The scavenger hunt element of the plot reflected a disturbing game-like quality that predated the escape room trend by many years. The detailed instructions, the time challenges, and the promise of keys that would save Wells's life all suggested a mind that took pleasure in creating elaborate puzzles with deadly stakes. As years passed, the collar bomb case took its place in the annals of America's most unusual crimes. It combined elements that seemed drawn from fiction: a bank robbery, a scavenger hunt, a collar bomb, a frozen corpse, into a real-life tragedy that claimed at least one life directly and destroyed many others in its wake. For residents of Erie, the case eventually became part of local lore, a dark chapter in the city's history that occasionally resurfaces when new books or documentaries bring it back into the national spotlight. The locations associated with the crime, the PNC Bank, the transmission tower site, Rothstein's home on Peach Street, became macabre landmarks, places that locals would point out to visitors with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. The legal aftermath of the case continued for years. Kenneth Barnes, sentenced to 22.5 years after his cooperation, continued to serve his time in federal prison. Floyd Stockton, who had received immunity but never testified due to health issues, lived out his remaining years in Washington state, occasionally giving interviews in which he minimized his role in the plot. The investigation officially concluded in 2018 when the FBI announced that they had identified all major participants in the conspiracy and that no further charges would be filed. This formal closure came 15 years after Brian Wells walked into the PNC Bank with a bomb around his neck, setting in motion one of the strangest criminal investigations in American history. Yet for many, questions remain. Could Wells have been saved if the bomb squad had arrived sooner? Were there other participants who were never identified? Did Rothstein take crucial secrets to his grave? The passage of time has made these questions increasingly difficult to answer as witnesses die, memories fade, and evidence deteriorates. What remains undisputed is the human cost of the crime. Brian Wells, whatever his level of involvement, died a horrific death. James Roden was murdered, allegedly to keep him from revealing the plot. The families of the victims were left to grapple with both loss and lingering questions about their loved ones' actions. Even the perpetrators paid a heavy price. Diehl-Armstrong spent her final years in prison, her brilliant mind consumed by mental illness and bitterness. Rothstein died of cancer less than a year after the crime, his legacy forever linked to this bizarre plot. Barnes lost decades of his life to incarceration. The collar bomb case stands as a reminder of the depths of human complexity, how intelligence can be twisted toward destructive ends, how mental illness can distort perception and morality, and how ordinary people can become entangled in extraordinary crimes. It also demonstrates the persistence of law enforcement in the face of a seemingly unsolvable case. The investigation spanned years, involved hundreds of interviews, and required expertise from multiple disciplines. The eventual resolution, while imperfect, represented a triumph of methodical detective work over a plot designed to confound and mislead. For those who study criminal behavior, the case offers a rare glimpse into a crime that defies easy categorization. It wasn't simply a bank robbery, a murder, or a conspiracy. It was all of these and more, a criminal plot that seemed designed as much to perplex investigators as to achieve its stated goal of obtaining money. Perhaps most disturbingly, the case reveals how vulnerable we all are to the machinations of others. Brian Wells, whether completely innocent or partially complicit, found himself trapped in a deadly game orchestrated by others, his fate sealed by a collar he could not remove and a bomb he could not defuse. In the end, the collar bomb case remains a testament to the reality that truth can indeed be stranger than fiction. No novelist would dare create a plot so convoluted, characters so bizarre, or an outcome so tragic, fearing readers would find it too implausible. Yet it happened on a summer day in Erie, Pennsylvania, forever changing the lives of everyone involved, and leaving behind a mystery that continues to fascinate and disturb us to this day. As time passes and the case recedes further into history, what remains is the cautionary tale of how human ingenuity, when directed toward destructive ends, can create suffering that ripples outward for generations. The collar bomb case may be closed in official terms, but its implications for criminal justice, for mental health treatment, for understanding the darker corners of human behavior, continue to resonate. And somewhere in Erie, Pennsylvania, on quiet nights when the wind blows in from Lake Erie, locals still sometimes speak in hushed tones about the pizza delivery man, the collar bomb, and the evil genius who may have orchestrated it all from beyond the grave.